Hello there and welcome to EPA Insights. I'm Laura from the Qualification Development team here at Highfield, and today I'm going to talk to you about the Team Leader Supervisor Standard, that's IFATE version 1.2, assessment plan number AP03. So why EPA Insights? Well, we want to be able to share with you what we've learned since assessing on this standard. This includes an analysis of the grades and looking at any common trends. We also want to acknowledge the change in assessment plans, whilst gaining assessor feedback and customer feedback where we may have had queries in the past. We hope that you find this useful. So firstly then we're going to unpick the challenge of moving from AP02 to AP03. Then we're going to look at take a closer look at each assessment method, starting with the presentation and Q&A, and then moving on to the professional discussion. Then finally, we'll finish off with some general hints and tips for endpoint assessment. So some apprentices have found AP03 more challenging, which shows in our grade profiles, and there may be several reasons for this. When looking at grading, AP02 was based on percentage scores achieved in each assessment method, meaning that the distinction rate was 80% on AP02 compared to 100% across all assessment criteria on AP03. When thinking about methods, the test and portfolio was removed, as was the need to examine the CPD log. AP03 now has two assessment methods. The portfolio in AP02 was made up of work allocated over the programme, which suits some apprentices to demonstrate knowledge and skill in this way. However, these learners may find AP03 more challenging. When thinking of theory, due to the removal of the test, a more theoretical knowledge is expected to come through in the presentation and professional discussion. But as well as knowing the theory, apprentices need to demonstrate how that theory works in practice with examples. So thinking about the presentation Q&A and specifically the presentation topic. Now, the assessment plan dictates that the presentation topic is not issued until after Gateway to ensure the apprentice works on their presentation whilst in the EPA period. Another topic can be requested if the learner genuinely hasn't experienced the topic they have been given and therefore unable to present on this. Now, learners can go outside the topic if needed because coverage of the criteria is important. So thinking about the assessment criteria for the presentation and Q&A, it's multifaceted. There are a lot of points to cover and learners need to make sure they cover all of these points. Remember, partially met is not met. They need to be able to give succinct examples as timing is key, and they need to be able to cover as much as possible in the presentation. The more that they cover in the presentation means that the Q&A can be used to clarify, build on and stretch the learner to distinction criteria if needed. Now what we're finding is that learners are not covering enough in the presentation, meaning that they need to cover an awful lot in the Q&A in the time allowed. So thinking about keywords then, some apprentices are failing to talk about key terms in the presentation, and it's really important that they are able to demonstrate their knowledge of these key terms, which are outlined in the assessment criteria. It's so important to emphasise these as much as possible throughout the presentation in order to meet the criteria. So thinking about the presentation and Q&A performance then, we analysed the proportion of learner reports where learners had failed to pass the presentation and Q&A. For each assessment criteria, you can see the proportion of learners who have either passed, failed, or not even been able to attempt the assessment criteria. The high proportion of brown means that learners in the main did not have the opportunity to attempt the criteria. Now we expect this to happen with distinction criteria where there was not the opportunity to stretch to these due to time constraints. We have identified other criteria where there are higher rates of learners who have attempted the criteria but unfortunately not passed. These seem to be the most common causes of failure within the presentation and Q&A. So some criteria in our EPA reports have now been combined to make them more succinct, and this is reflected in the updated EPA kit. Now looking at those common assessment criteria failures, we've got OC2, describe how an organisational strategy is arrived at. Now the trap here is that learners are simply just stating the strategy. They should prepare to explain how it was developed and why it was introduced, and how it is cascaded through the organisation. OC4 describe how they remain flexible in delivering the organisation's strategy. Again, the trap here is that learners simply state how they help to deliver the strategy. What they should do is give an example of where they have been flexible to ensure they deliver the strategy and how targets have been achieved. PS1, apply problem solving and decision-making techniques and adapt to change. Now again, the trap here is that learners are just describing the techniques. They should provide real examples of where both of these have been applied and how they adapt to change within their organisation. And with PSA, explain approaches taken to manage a stakeholder and customer relationships, which makes reference to emotional intelligence and conflict management techniques. The trap here is that learners are forgetting to make reference to emotional intelligence and conflict management, or forgetting to cover both stakeholder and customer. They should provide real examples of how they have used emotional intelligence and conflict management to manage both of these types of relationships. So now let's move on to the professional discussion. Looking at the assessment criteria, they are multifaceted. There is a lot to cover. Learners need to make sure they cover all points. And remember, partially met is not met. They need to be able to give succinct examples and stay on topic because timing is tight. They can take notes with them into the professional discussion. However, please make sure these are clear and concise. There is also some project management criteria that they need to cover in the professional discussion. Now they can cover this by talking about the project for their presentation and Q&A. So some apprentices are failing to talk about key terms in the professional discussion. It's really important that they are able to demonstrate their knowledge of these key terms, which are outlined in the assessment criteria. It's so important that they emphasise these as much as possible throughout that discussion and use them to provide real examples. So again, we analysed a proportion of learner reports where learners had failed to pass the professional discussion. For each assessment criteria here, you can see the proportion of learners who have either passed, failed, or not even been able to attempt the assessment criteria. The high proportion of brown means that learners in the main did not have the opportunity to attempt the criteria. Again, we expect this to happen with distinction criteria where there was not the opportunity to stretch to these due to time constraints. Now we've identified other criteria here where there are higher rates of learners who have attempted the criteria but unfortunately not passed. These seem to be the most common causes of failure within the professional discussion. So let's look at those common assessment criteria failures in more detail. BH3, describe how they have developed a high-performing and motivated team by building trust and using their understanding of team dynamics, management models, emotional intelligence, active listening, and learning styles. Now, the trap here is that learners are not covering all aspects of that criteria. They should prepare to explain how they build trust and develop the team, give specific examples of when they have used negotiation and influencing skills across the team or dealt with conflict. PM1, explain the project life cycle and how they have employed relevant project management tools to deliver a project against targets. Now, the trap here is that some learners are not understanding the project life cycle. They should prepare to explain the project life cycle as well as how project management tools were used to deliver a project. PM2, monitor performance and take appropriate and timely corrective action as required to support a successful project outcome. Now, the trap here is that learners are not giving examples of effective actions. They should explain how they monitor the progress of the project and give examples of where there may have been challenges and what the learner did to manage them. So now let's move on to some general hints and tips for endpoint assessment. So thinking about EPA reports, all learners will receive an EPA report. You should use these reports to analyse for your learners which particular areas or assessment criteria they struggle on. And this will help you to continuously improve the quality of your learning programs. Now, when thinking about support materials, our EPA kits have amplification to further describe the areas that will be assessed. There are also think about documents for learners to help them prepare for endpoint assessment from a practical point of view, as well as explaining what will be covered. Now, all of these materials are available to download from our website. Now, when thinking about mock assessments, They are an absolute essential part of being prepared for endpoint assessment. Make sure your learners have practiced at delivering a presentation within a time limit and have taken part in a professional discussion, ideally with someone they're not familiar with. Well, all that's left to say from me is thank you for watching, and we hope that you found this useful.